Reflecting on sacred words means that we recognize how powerful words really are, that they are as important and essential to our faith as our actions are. Partly because our words so many times precede our actions, that our words have a way of shaping what we do. And one of those words that has been used by the church for centuries is the word fall, as in the story of the fall of humanity, the story about Adam and Eve. So how is it that we say that word, or we have said that word? And how can it or should it shape our actions? That words are quite powerful. As Jonathan Merritt writes, sacred words are containers that carry information about deep and often invisible realities. But those invisible realities become visible in what we do because of our words. That if we think about it, someone might speak and our interest is piqued, or our heart skips a beat, or our spirits are stirred, our conscience is pricked, our lives are even changed by a mere word. So how do we say that sacred word fall? The story of the fall of humanity, where Adam and Eve are duped by the serpent or snake, there at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where they fell from innocence, tempted perhaps to become greater than God, where then they knew and saw the reality of good and evil. So how have we said that sacred word, fall? In talking about the story of the fall of humanity, perhaps the church has tried to use that word to call people away from sin and to the church, to point out what is needed or what is wrong, what Adam and Eve did or what we do. But so often, in how that story is told, how that word is said, that the tone of how we say it, the character of how we tell the story hasn't called people to the church. It's even kept people away from the church, thinking that the gospel is more about condemnation than salvation, more about judgment than love, more about exclusion than embrace. So how do we avoid the mistakes of yesterday? Sometimes, like the ostrich putting its head in the sand, we just decide to avoid the word, that we should not talk about the fall or that story, to pretend as if it never existed, that we do not reclaim it, redefine it, or rediscover it. Instead, we remove it from our vocabulary. That instead of talking about the fall, we put that word away and we solely talk about grace. And there is something beautiful and good and necessary about focusing on grace. The problem, though, comes up when there are further questions about the depths of grace, and we start asking, grace from what? And not only that, perhaps we've all been in that place in our lives where the burdens of our mistakes are so heavy and we need help carrying them or even putting them down and leaving them behind, and we need someone who will help us by taking seriously the burdens that we are carrying, to help us through them. So pretending as if those concerns do not exist, at some point at least, begins to fail us. So perhaps another response, instead of removing that word from our vocabulary, is saying it in a completely different way, perhaps a way that is more faithful to the original story. And we don't talk so much about what Adam and Eve did as much about what was lost. That it was a loss of innocence. Now knowing the reality of good and evil, like that moment in our lives where we are confronted with the fact that there is such thing in this world as innocent suffering, and all of a sudden the veil is pulled from in front of our face and we see the world differently. We notice the tragedy in it and the heartache that everyone faces. That there's a loss of innocence because sin is a thief. It robs us of the fullness of life, where grace gives us a vision of the fullness of life as it restores and redeems and renews. That grace leans down, picks us up, dusts us off after we have fallen down, and points us in a good direction. And then when we talk about the fall, perhaps we don't speak of individuals, but rather of all creation. That the loss of innocence is not just my burden to bear, it is a burden shared by all of creation. That now there is both the knowledge of good and evil throughout this world, and it threatens all of us because it is a thief, robbing us of a genuine and gentle innocence. So the fall might be something we refer to for all of creation. Whereas Adam and Eve did not hear God's voice, rather they only heard the voice of the serpent, which many times is just the voice of the status quo. That there have been times, like in the days of segregation, or even before in slavery, where the church just held to the voice of the status quo. And because of that, there was a loss of innocence, the reality of good and evil, that collectively we must listen for a different voice that calls us to restoration, to renewal, to redemption, to something different, to something closer akin to the vision we find in grace, to the fullness of life where everyone is loved and embraced. That we might take this same word, but say it in a very different way, to use it in a very different kind of sentence, a word that doesn't condemn, but simply describes the burden shared throughout all of creation. That we all see the burdens of evil, the despair of tragedy, the heartaches of all humanity. And we know something is lost because of them, because of poverty or cruelty, because of abuse or indifference. That something has been lost because of those things. And perhaps we could look out upon the world, see where creation has fallen down and skinned its knee, and go to those places to offer the healing and comfort of grace, the support and hope of mercy, the courage and strength of justice, that we look for evidence of what has been lost, and we go to help participate in what God's love is doing throughout the world. That how we use words is so important. That if we tell that story about Adam and Eve in such a way that views God as condemning, we end up spending our whole lives condemning others. But if we tell the stories of our faith, if we say those sacred words in such a way where we are listening to others, picking others up when they fall down, offering embrace and love and mercy, if we see those things in God, we spend our lives doing them as well, where we are transformed along with all of creation, seeking that vision of what grace calls us to bear upon this world. Amen.